Hey everyone, it's me. I am here to give you a quick kind of rapid fire lecture on personal identity, which is the question that we've been working on recently in philosophy class. You'll notice a few things. First of all, I have been battling a little bit of a cold, so I sound stuffy and maybe look a little rough, but that's why. Secondly, you're going to see me looking over back and forth like that. It's just because I have some notes to the side here. I want to make sure I touch on some specific points as I run through this context lecture. The third thing that you'll notice is that I'm also dressed casually. I hope that's okay. It's just because I'm a little under the weather and I thought I would dress casually. So, all right, let's just jump right into it then. So, the question that we've been wrestling with, and we're on this is the third bite now because it's a context lecture. The question we've been wrestling with is what does it mean for me to be me? Or another way of putting that is what constitutes my personal identity, or what makes me me? So this is a fundamental philosophical question, as you know from our Swinburne reading, and it's a slightly different question than um, like how do I feel about the world, or what are my interpretations of the world, what do I think is important or not important. It's a different question. That question is a categorically kind of what we call a question. Those questions are about the sense of self. That is like, what do I think of when I think about who I am? So your idea of yourself is like the story that you tell yourself about who you are, the kind of clothes you like, the music you listen to, things that you value, that sort of stuff. There's a separate set of questions, which is the question that we're dealing with around personal identity, which is not the question of self, question of personal identity, which is more of a logical question. And that question is something like, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions that make me up? Another way of putting that is, how do I know that the thing that's right here, right now, is the same person as the person who was in front of you last Tuesday when we were having class together? So it's a slightly different question, but the subtlety and the difference is actually makes a big difference in terms of how the actual arguments go. So the question of personal identity is, how do I know that I am the same person that I think I was in the past, or there was a person at time one that was 9-year-old Andy, and there's a person at time two, which is 38-year-old Andy. And the question is, how do I know, or what makes the 9-year-old me and the 38-year-old me the same me over time? So you see how that's a very different question than like, what do I think of when I think of who I am, what I'm about, and my preferences and that sort of stuff. All right, so that's the question, right? What does it mean to be me? How do I know this me is the same me as the me that I experienced in the past? And what am I really? So those are the questions that we're dealing with. Now, we have a handful of theories that try to answer that question. There's actually 3 of them that are covered in the secondary reading and the primary source, the Richard Swinburne. I'm going to cover them in the opposite order that Swinburne did. So he started with I'm going to cover them in the opposite order that the book covers them in. I'm going to map more closely what Swinburne did. So we'll start with the empiricist or the bodily theory. Then we'll talk about John Locke's memory theory, and then we'll talk about the soul theory at the end. So in that sense, I'm mapping Swinburne's argument, but I'm going to be supplementing with some of my own thoughts as a philosopher and some of the secondary source material as well, which I actually think is pretty well done. All right, so if the question is, who am I, or what makes me the me in the past, the me in the present, how are those things connected? Or for that matter, the me that will be in the future, how do I know that's going to be the same me as me? There's a couple ways to answer the question, or there's a handful of ways the question has been answered, and then I'll give you some summary thoughts of my own at the end. So the first answer that we talked about in class during the symposium, but to just flesh out again now, is the body theory. So this is the idea, it's sort of intuitive, right? It's that the 9-year-old me and the 38-year-old me are the same me because we inhabit the same body. Sure, it looks a little different. I am taller now than I was. My skin's a little more wrinkly than it was. I have less hair than I did when I was 9 years old. But I know in some ways I'm also better. I'm stronger, for example. Thank you, CrossFit. But the core idea here is that because I inhabit the same body that I inhabited when I was 9, then I can say that I am the same person that the 9-year-old me was. That sounds sort of intuitive, right? I mean, I think I can hear James in my head, right? The Jameses of the world say, yeah, of course, look, you're overcomplicating the question. It's not that difficult. If you had the same body then and you have the same body now, guess what? You are the same body, same person. Um, but with just a little bit of reflection, I think we start to see that it can't be as simple as, or it's not as simple as we think it is, according to bodily theory. So here's a handful of problems with it. First of all, um, remember the Theseus ship example we talked about, or Bailey's ship example, not Theseus. Theseus, it comes from a Greek myth, but we said let's imagine Bailey's on a boat. She's a sailor. The boat's leaking. She has to replace each of the boards, and by the time the boat lands in port, wherever it was going to go, I think London or something, all of the planks in the boat, everything has been replaced. Is it the same boat? And we said, well, we don't think it is. I think it's a different boat because it's composed of different matter, different material. And the same thing is true in Theseus's boat. So Theseus is this Greek hero. He's sailing, and on the way, the boat's leaking, so they switch up the pieces on the way. It's a different boat when it arrives. Socrates asked the question, is it the same boat? And we decided that it wasn't. And the reason why this story is important is because it's a metaphor for our own physical bodies, right? Over time, our bodies replace their cells. You shed skin. I mean, even things like your heart, the cells that are making up your heart when you're 9 die, change, and are replaced, regenerated. So the question is, if my body is me and my body is always changing, in fact, my body's been 100% replaced from the time I was 9 to the time I was now, then am I something different since I am composed of something different? So that's one challenge to the bodily theory. The response to the challenge is, so if I'm arguing on behalf of the bodily theory, the response is that, well, look, this slow kind of degeneration and replacement over time doesn't really undermine the idea that it's the same body, in the sense that it's not as though some other cells from some other body were put in mine and replaced, right? We get into these thought experiments. This slow replacing over time actually preserves the body. So we might say that Theseus's boat is still Theseus's boat, or the Pequod, I think we said, Bailey's boat is still Bailey's boat, even though the pieces have been replaced. But that does raise a question of, well, what is it that we think is Bailey's boat if we can change all of the pieces and yet it still is the same? So a second objection to the bodily theory is that if we really push you far enough, bodily theorists, what we really discover is that you don't actually think that it's the body that makes the person, it's the brain. In other words, I could cut off my arm and replace it with another arm, or replace it with a robot arm or something like that, and you would still say I'm me, even though pieces of my body have been changed out. But if you take my brain out and put somebody else's brain in, then you are going to say, I don't know, it's a little more complicated than that. So that who I am is actually going to follow my brain matter. So like my brain matter is like, 3.5 pounds or whatever it is of just flesh and a bunch of neurons firing. But you're going to say, the bodily theorist is going to say, look, okay, fine, your body, pieces of your body can be changed, but there's one piece of your body that's crucial to personal identity, and that's your brain, because it's the seat or the house of all of consciousness, and so, or at least it produces consciousness. So in that sense, your brain is who you really are. So that's fine. The counter argument to that idea for the bodily theorists is, what do we do with the person? So let's imagine you have the brain swap, right? You have a criminal on one hand and you have an innocent person on the other. You do the brain swap. So now the innocent person's brain is in the criminal's body and the criminal's brain is in the innocent person's body. And then we want to punish somebody for the crime. Do we punish the innocent person's body with the criminal mind, or do we punish the criminal person's body with the innocent mind? Both of them seem to be problematic, because if we punish the innocent person's body with the criminal mind, we've punished a physical body that did no crime. And if we punish the criminal person's body with the innocent person's mind, then we've punished the body that caused the crime, but we've also punished the mind that didn't. So actually in the law, we make a distinction between actus reus and mens rea. In other words, you have to be convicted of a crime, you have to both have the mental state and have done the action with your body. Both of those things have to occur in order for you to be convicted. So the problem of the brain swap for the bodily theorists illustrates the idea that it's actually not so simple to determine who is held morally accountable if the seat of personal identity actually is the brain. Okay? So those are, in my opinion, those are pretty serious counter arguments to the idea that your personal identity is reducible to your body, or even in particular your brain. At the very least, it complicates the issue for me personally, what if it's, you don't have to think what I think, but for me personally, it complicates it to the point that it's no longer a satisfactory answer. That we would look somewhere else for an answer to the question of personal identity. So where else might we look? The second theory that we discussed was the memory theory. So this came up from John Locke, who's the famous empiricist that also came up when we were talking about Hume. So for Locke, who you are is the composite of your memories. So the person who remembers the stuff that you experienced is you. So you're made up of what you are. Your personal identity is made up of your memories. Minor or an important distinction to make that's a little subtle is it actually doesn't matter whether or not what you remember really happened or not. So there's a difference between real memories and apparent memories. The Lockean memory theory suggests that it doesn't matter whether or not the memories that you're having actually happened in the past, like were caused by some actual event in the past. Only that there is a continuity of memories. So I might, remember at some point in my life when I did, hit a home run at a baseball game, which, by the way, has never happened in my life. I'm like the worst athlete ever. So I hit a home run, right? Let's imagine that my whole life I've been telling myself the story about how I hit a home run. Maybe I didn't hit the home run. That's fine, says Locke. It doesn't matter. What matters is that there's a continuity of memory with regard to hitting that home run. And that continuity of memory is what makes me me. All right, so that sounds fine. That sounds good. Like, all right, it avoids a lot of the problems that the brain theory and the body theory come up with because we have this memory thing that persists throughout time. On the other hand, there's some problems as well as we saw in the Swinburne argument with the memory theory. The first one is that you can forget. And if you forget the memory on its most simple form, if I am my memories and I forget some memories, then the me now that no longer has the memory of the me in the past makes the me in the past and the me now two different me's. Because we don't share the memory that connects us up. Locke gets around. This is the problem, by the way. I think Thomas Reid is the guy who came up with this. Was the one where we said, oh, imagine there's a young boy who gets flogged for stealing something from an orchard. He grows up to be a soldier and he does something valiant in war, and then that soldier grows up to be a retired general. Now imagine that the soldier that does something valiant remembers being a young boy and getting flogged, and the old man remembers being a soldier that does something valiant, but the old man doesn't remember being a young boy and getting flogged. According to the memory theory, in its simplest form, the old man and the young boy are not the same man because they don't share the same memories. However, Locke gets around this problem by saying there's a chain of memories. So you have the guy in the middle, the young man, who remembers being the young boy, and you have the old man who remembers being the young man. So that chain is enough to link the memory. Each person doesn't have to remember all the memories as long as there's one person who remembers a person who remembers the memory. If this is all very confusing, two things I would say. One is just reread the Swinburne, and the second thing is reread the secondary source, the Stitch book. All right, so that's memory theory. The big problem with memory theory is the problem of duplication. So we can solve the forgetting problem, but the problem of duplication is tough. So this is the example we talked about with Guy Fawkes. So let's say there's a guy, Guy Fawkes, in the past who wanted to blow up British Parliament. And he gets caught and he gets executed, which historically happened. Now imagine, 30 years later, there's a guy named Gary. And Gary has all of the memories of Guy Fawkes. Everything he says carries the veracity. They're accurate. His memories are believable. Everything that and he says, I'm Guy Fawkes. Everything that we have to verify whether or not he is Guy Fawkes lines up. Okay, so fair enough. So we would say in this case, yeah, he most probably is Guy Fawkes. Something must have happened. He didn't really die. This is the guy on the memory theory. This is Guy Fawkes. Now imagine there's another person, Rick. So Rick, exact same thing as Gary, right? Has all the memories of Guy Fawkes. But Gary has blonde hair, Rick has brown hair. Gary likes dogs, Rick likes cats. Gary lives in New York, and Rick lives in London. Under the theory of identity, because they have the memories of Guy Fawkes, they are Guy Fawkes, but they also have the same memories as to each other. And so the theory would suggest that they are also each other. But they're not each other, right? They're literally different people in different places in different times. It's like Elizabeth and Diana, her sister, the example we had in the symposium. So the problem with the memory theory is that if you duplicate a person, then you have the possibility that they are each one person and also not the same person. They're both the same person and not the same person at the same time. That's a logical contradiction, and we can't have that in terms of philosophy because anything can follow from a logical contradiction. So there's a serious problem, the duplication problem that arises with the memory theory. By the way, as a side note, the duplication problem also arises for the brain theory. So both of them are going to suffer what, in my opinion, is a pretty compelling argument against memory theory um, as a cogent theory or consistent theory, credible theory of identity. So that brings us to the last theory. The last theory is the soul theory, and it's a little tough to pin down, right? So the soul theory is the idea that we all have a mind or a soul. It's immaterial, it's non-substantial, so you can't taste it, feel it, touch it, but intuitively you know it's there. It's that thing, that unspoken thing that makes up who you are. You kind of experience it, but you can't measure it. And the seat of memory or the seat of personal identity is consciousness. It might be your brain, it might not be your brain, but you have a soul, and that soul is what makes you who you are. So that's the soul theory. The problem with the soul theory, you sort of can hear implicitly, is that the soul theory is hard to verify. So, like, let's say you go home to have dinner with your mom, and there's a person who's acting just like your mom, doing everything that your mom would normally do. There's no really way for you to know whether or not the person that's acting like your mom is actually your mom, because you can't check and like see if she has the right soul. So what a soul is, it complicates the soul theory itself. Although, on the other hand, it resonates with us because we do experience the world like we have a mind that's independent and different from whatever our body is. Again, this is Descartes, right? The Cartesian mind problem. It's easy to separate the mind from the body. It's a lot harder to stick them back together. All right, so where does this leave us? I think it leaves us with some viable options. First of all, you're sort of free to see which of these are convincing, or just use them as springboards to do more investigation. We obviously haven't exhausted the entire question and all of the theories. If you're interested in personal identity, there's a lot of good reading around it. I can help you with that. Also in the Stitch and Donaldson book, there's a good reading list at the end of the chapter. There's also another question as to why this is even important in the first place. So the big reason why the question of personal identity is important is because it's really tied to the question of justice, especially in our contemporary age, right? We talk a lot about the importance of identity and identity politics, and the idea here is that there are certain identities that, insofar as people have identified a certain way, they've also been persecuted for that, right? So we have African Americans in the U.S. who were enslaved by virtue of the fact that their identity included black skin. We have LGBTQ folks who have been socially chastised and oppressed because of their sexual identity or their gender identity or their racial identity, something like that. I mean, obviously, you know what I'm saying. There's a lot of questions as to what constitutes our identity, but more importantly, what identities are permissible within a social context. And that seems to be fluid and seems to be open to challenge, which is why we have things like these identity movements that are going on now that are constantly calling into question what our social or cultural standards are around what is and isn't permissible. That itself is a fluid thing. So the idea behind personal identity's current relevance is that we're trying to drive to a more just world, and we have the idea that justice requires that we recognize this multiplicity of identities. So that's one point. Identity is connected in some ways to us to justice. The second reason why it's important is because a fourth theory that I won't go into too much detail about right now, but just to tease a little bit, is that there's a theory of identity that says that identity is a construct, that there actually is no such thing as personal identity, that there is no substantial thing that makes you you. There's no mind, there's no piece of flesh, there's no memory that makes you you. Who you are is this narrative. Who you are is a story that you tell yourself, or a story that's told to you, or some combination of those two things. And if that's the case, if identity is a construct and not a metaphysical thing out in the world, whether it's a material brain or an immaterial soul, if instead identity is fluid, contingent, changing, and constructed, then at the same time it's unstable and it's constantly deconstructing itself. And so philosophically, what that means for us is we always have to be holding loosely the idea of identity as it pertains to us. And maybe we use identity as a tool, as I discussed earlier, to drive towards justice. So we push identities in order to highlight injustices that have occurred when it's expedient for us to do so. But at the same time, we hold lightly the idea of identity because we recognize that there's no metaphysical substance that's driving behind it, and it's always deconstructing. Failure to appreciate the fact that identity is both constructed and deconstructed leads us to sort of latch on to these conceptual ideas of identity, and then we force them against each other, and we have conflict and outrage all over the place, right? Sound familiar, social media? So anyway, I'm not suggesting you have to agree with that analysis at the end. I'm just suggesting that from a sort of contemporary postmodern perspective, the idea of identity at all is sort of being, the possibility of identity itself is being scrutinized. So that's sort of a fourth way of thinking about the question of identity. All right, I've rambled on long enough. Hopefully this has been thoughtful. We'll pick it back up next week. This is a great class. I'm having a ton of fun philosophizing with you. So I'll see you soon.